Joy of Life Chapter 1, the story begins. Danzhou Port, located to the east of the Kingdom of Qing, though situated by the sea, had gradually fallen into decline. This was because several ports in the south had been developed, and the anticipated sea routes to the west had long been connected. As a result, the nation's trade center had shifted to the south, and the once bustling port had become quiet several years ago. Seagulls soared freely, no longer harassed by the detestable sailors. However, the residents who originally lived in Danzhou Port did not feel significant changes in their lives. While their income had decreased somewhat, His Majesty the Emperor had long exempted this place from taxes for several years. Therefore, life was still decent, and this seaside town, now even quieter, naturally became more suitable for people to live in. Occasionally, some influential figures would choose to build estates here. But due to the remote distance from the capital, there were not many officials who truly stayed. The only ones who could be considered as such were the elderly lady living in the mansion on the western side of the town. It was said that the elderly lady was the mother of the Count of Xian, who held a high position in the capital. She had chosen to retire here. The residents in town knew that the Count of Xian seemed to be highly regarded by His Majesty the Emperor, as he had not been dispatched outside of the capital in violation of the usual laws. Instead, he had been working in the Treasury Department within the capital city. Therefore, most people in town showed enough courtesy and respect towards that mansion. But young children don't understand these things. On this day, with the gentle breeze and bright sun, the adults sat in a tavern, enjoying the salty sea breeze and the moistness it brought, relishing the salted plums and the drinks in their cups. There was also a group of teenagers, around 15 years old, huddled outside the back doorsteps of the Count of Xian's mansion in the west of the town, packed closely together, doing something mysterious. Upon closer inspection, it turned out to be quite an interesting scene. These teenagers were all listening to a child who was only 4 or 5 years old, speaking animatedly. The young boy was exceptionally handsome, with perfectly arched eyebrows and clear, bright eyes. Despite his babyish voice, his tone was oddly mature. He sighed and gestured with his tiny arms, saying, "So." Chumen walked up to the wall, found a ladder there, and climbed step by step until he reached the door. He pushed it open. "Then what happened?" one of the teenagers asked. "And then?" "Well, of course, he returned to the mortal world," the young boy pouted, seeming impatient with the rather simple-minded questions from the older boys beside him. "Really? Won't Chumen go beat up that Hani guy?" another teenager chimed in. "Yeah, didn't Chumen want to get revenge on Hani for keeping him locked up for so many years?" The young boy shrugged his shoulders. "No, he didn't." "Ugh. That's no fun." Young Master Fan Xian, today's story isn't as exciting as the ones from the past few days. What would you like to hear, then? Stories of epic journeys. Tales of romantic adventures. PFF. The boy named Fan Xian raised his middle finger at the older children around him. Fighting and killing isn't healthy, and treasure hunting all over the place isn't environmentally friendly. Suddenly, a very angry voice came from the courtyard. "Young master! Where have you gone again?" The children formed a circle, imitating his gesture and raising their middle fingers, making the scene much more spectacular due to their numbers. In unison, they all said, "PFF," and then dispersed, laughing mischievously. Fan Xian, the young boy, stood up from the stone steps, brushed off the dust from his pants, and as he turned to go back into the courtyard, just before closing the gate, his eyes, full of mischief, glanced at the young blind owner of the grocery store across the street. A complex emotion crossed his face, completely at odds with his age, before he gently closed the wooden gate. This was Fan Xian's 4th year in this world. Over these years, he had finally come to understand that he wasn't dreaming, he had truly entered an unknown world. This world seemed similar to the one he remembered, yet there were many differences. Through eavesdropping on the conversations of the servants in the Count of Xian's mansion, he had finally grasped his own identity. It turned out he was the illegitimate child of the Count of Xian in the capital city. Just like in typical tales of aristocratic feuds, being an illegitimate child made him vulnerable to the schemes of his step-aunts and others. On top of that, it seemed his dear old dad had no other sons but him, so in order to continue the lineage of the Count, he had been sent to the distant Danzhou port. Over the years, he had gradually grown accustomed to his new identity. Although having an adult soul trapped in a child's body was an entirely different experience, both physically and mentally, and might drive a normal person mad, it was a fortunate coincidence that in his previous life, Xian had suffered from severe myasthenia gravis, having been bedridden for many years. His current inconvenience was minor in comparison to the miserable condition he had endured in his past life. Thus, he now resided in this child's body without too much discomfort. The most uncomfortable thing for him was actually his current name. When he was 1 year old, a letter arrived from the Count in the capital city, giving him the name Xian, with the courtesy name Anji. This name didn't sit well with him, it sounded very similar to an insult from his hometown people with time to burn. However, he was just a child in appearance, so it was impossible for him to voice his opposition. In his previous life, when he was being treated at the hospital, he could still move his head initially. So, he often begged the lovely nurse to buy him pirated DVDs and books to read. After living in the Count's mansion for a long time, although the old lady seemed cold on the surface but was actually warm-hearted, and the servants in the mansion did not treat him differently due to his illegitimate status, the pain of having no one to communicate with still bothered him. Could he tell the maids that he came from another world? Could he inform his tutor that he could actually recognize all the characters in the books? So, he would often sneak out of the Count's mansion through a side gate and play with the commoner children on the street. More often than not, he would tell them stories from his world about movies and novels. It seemed like he wanted to remind himself of something, to remind himself that he didn't belong to this world. In his own world, there were movies, there was the internet, and there were erotic novels. Until today, for reasons unknown to him, he recounted the movie The Truman Show. The plot of this movie was somewhat stiff, and it didn't feature someone as charming as Jim Carrey, so he should have been aware that the teenagers of Danzhou Port were unlikely to enjoy it. But he still told the story. Because deep within him, there was always a sense of absurdity. He was clearly someone who was supposed to die, so why had he suddenly been reborn in this body? It made him think of that movie. Perhaps, the people and streets before him, the seagulls soaring in the sky, were all arranged by someone? Just like the old movie The Truman Show. Truman eventually discovered the falsehood of the world he was in and decisively sailed away to find an exit. But Xian, no, he should be called Xian now, he knew he wasn't Truman, and this world indeed existed as a reality, not a giant soundstage. So, he found it absurd to tell stories every day to remind himself that he was from another world. This act in itself was quite ludicrous.